Hi, and welcome back to the Quickening stream. I'm your host, Ryan from Zadok YouTube channel, and I'm here with three co-hosts. Logan from FIREBRAND Ministries. Hi, Logan.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, buddy. I'm here also with Bruce from JustThoughtsstudies YouTube channel,
Good evening, all.
and Sam from Mark13records.com.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, anytime, buddy, anytime. So you may remember them from the Four Winds Bible studies. Now, as previously stated in our first episode of the Quickening stream, we're going to be covering the four hidden dynasties of the end times, which are education, economics, politics, and religion. In this episode of the Quickening stream, we are discussing the hidden dynasty of economics. Now, I want to start this second episode off on economics. I want to start it off on a quote I found of Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson, as you know, of course, was one of our presidents, and back in 1834, Andrew Jackson was addressing Philadelphia bankers. They went to meet with him, and he wasn't too pleased with how they had been running our country. At this time, Andrew Jackson was facing a lot of fallout because he was not wanting to approve the Second Bank of the United States to continue its charter. And so I have this quote here, and Logan, I'm going to direct this to you, and I'm going to go ahead and begin, and I'm going to look for some comments after this. So Andrew Jackson says, "Gentlemen, I too have been a close observer of the doings of the Bank of the United States. I have had men watching you for a long time, and I am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves. I have determined to rout you out, and by the eternal, I will rout you out." Now, Logan, do you think it's interesting that Andrew Jackson referred to these speculators, to these bankers, as a den of vipers and thieves?
Absolutely, I think it fits perfectly. What comes to mind right off the bat is Matthew chapter 23. I believe it's the 33rd verse where Christ was talking about, the Kenites who are in control of these four hidden dynasties, and he straight up says, "Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell?" And in this chapter, he's going on about saying that outwardly, they appear unto men and to the world to be doing good, and they appear to be, doing righteous things, but inwardly they're, destroying. They're wicked, full of wickedness.
Mm-hmm. So, given what he said, it sounds like he knew these guys were the same guys that Christ was talking about, the scribes and the Pharisees. And it sounds to me like this would be almost a type of when Christ went into the temple and knocked over the money changers' tables. Would you agree with that?
I would, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Moving on. Bruce or Sam, do you gentlemen have anything to say on this to add to it at all?
Well, I mean, we know that the economy is one of the four hidden dynasties, and it's money, money, money. It's all about money. I have alluded to Deuteronomy 28 quite a number of times in quite a number of studies. If you go to that chapter and check out the blessings, you can see how God blesses a nation or a people that follow his laws, deal with fair weights and balances, do that which they should. And you can also check out the cursings in that chapter, and you will see that a nation that turns its back on God, does not obey his laws, is subject to be taken down from within by the strangers amongst them. And in this case, moreover, it is the Kenite and the Kenites in power through many different facets of the four hidden dynasties. In other words, you can see how this economy intertwines with the other three to become a force an agenda of the four hidden dynasties, which gains in power to bring about this world government. In other words, in the economy aspect, it's the money and the value of your money, which is intertwined with, what we touched on last time. I believe we mentioned the minimum wage last time, but you can see how that these four hidden dynasties are intertwined. This country now is in more debt than it has ever been in before. But does that stop them from spending? No, it doesn't. Rather, they spend all the more, asking for more and more and more. More money for pork barrel pursuits, more money for illegals, more money for the quote-unquote disenfranchised, in other words, for the entitlement mentality. Yet, those who have paid in all of their lives, in other words, who have earned Social Security checks, have their Social Security checks shrunken down to where they can't even make it. And that goes along right alongside with our veterans who don't get the medical care that they need. Many of them die awaiting proper care. And, this president was going to take care of all that so that everybody had universal health care. Yet we have veterans living on the side of the road. In other words, they're not getting the medical benefits they were guaranteed. So you can see how this relates to the subject of our last broadcast, the educational system. And in subsequent weeks, as we do the rest of the four hidden dynasties, you will see how it all ties together. Because the government is using its power, or I should say abusing its power, giving people things like universal health care, which is not a right. I mean, you can go to any emergency room in the country right now and you will not be turned away. We already have universal health care. And if they do turn you away, what happens? They get sued. And when they get sued, guess what happens? Well, that causes the price to rise on everything from insurance to your next hospital bill. So these people look to the government, Big Brother, to be their salvation, to keep them from having no coverage. When really all this is an agenda, a way to spend up more money to pay for things which those in power, in other words, the politicians, claim are rights. Like, here's a couple of great examples. Government-funded abortions. Oh, now that's really a right, isn't it? How about government-funded sex changes? There's another right, at least the government claims. When the hell were these things ever the government's business? And what gives them the right to place these burdens on the backs of the taxpayers? And the terminally poor, in other words, those who stay poor because they're given entitlements just so they can get by, and so that they won't better themselves, because let me put it this way. If a person is living off the entitlement mentality and they're getting all these benefits like welfare, free cell phone, free gas, WIC, SNAP, dozens of other programs, HUD housing, then they're not likely to get out and try to better themselves. They're not likely to work because they will lose those entitlements. So you can see how this works as a snare, in other words, a trap, to keep them poor so that politicians can continually pander to them and come up to them and say, there, you have suffered so badly, we will save you. Here's your free cell phone, here's your free gas card, here's your free low-income housing, here's your food stamps. Meanwhile, those of us who work for a living and pay our taxes are the ones that bear the burden of this cost. That is to say, the cost of those who are along for the ride. And in this way, they are controlled by the government, and we are controlled by the government. And prices rise, wages don't measure up, and people do like what we talked about last week. They call for a hike in the minimum wage, but even if they give it, the curb is not going to keep them, and they're still not going to be able to pay their bills, because once the minimum wage goes up, the employer has to charge more. And it's just an unending chain of spending money for feel-good politics. But for those of us that work for a living, buy our own houses, buy our own cars, buy our own cell phones, buy our own gas, guess what happens if we fail to pay our taxes? Well, we go to jail. So you can see how these four hidden dynasties work as a trap.
That's exactly what they are. They are a trap. Now, Sam, what would you say, as far as this specific hidden dynasty of economics, what would you say would be the face of it all? What would you say would be the easiest part of it to see? I know it's all around us, but what would you say here in the United States, at the very least, would be the primary example here in the United States of this hidden dynasty?
The Federal Reserve Bank, but that mutated into the IMF and World Bank in 1944 and 45. But the Federal Reserve Bank in 1913 is when they pretty well took over America with a central bank, which is what Jackson tried to get rid of. And but with the four hidden dynasties, as far as trumpets are concerned, you want to look at when they went global, and that would be in the 1944 with the IMF and 1945 with the World Bank. But as far as the Federal Reserve goes, I have this article by Dean Henderson that everybody should go check out. The House of Morgan, talking about J.P. Morgan, the originator of it. And the first paragraph reads, and I'll just read the first paragraph here. The Federal Reserve Bank was born in 1913, the same year U.S. banking scion J.P. Morgan died and the Rockefeller Foundation was formed. The House of Morgan presided over American finance from the corner of Wall Street and Broad, acting as quasi-U.S. central bank since 1838, when George Peabody founded it in London. Peabody was a business associate of the Rothschilds. In 1952, Fed researcher Eustace Mullins put forth the supposition that the Morgans were nothing more than Rothschild agents. Mullins wrote that the Rothschilds, quote, preferred to operate anonymously in the U.S. behind the facade of J.P. Morgan and Company.
Okay. Now, this Federal Reserve System that came about is, what do we need to know about this? What is it exactly, and who runs it?
Well, it's pretty self-evident to know who runs it. I mean, everyone thinks that because it's federal, that it must be part of the government, but it's not part of the government. It is a privately owned bank, and guess who owns it? Well, you've got your Rockefellers, your Rothschilds, you've got these bloodlines of the Kenites that are empowering all of this. So if you want to know who owns it, then you can follow the money trail, and it's going to lead you right back to them. In other words, even in the old biblical times, the Kenites were merchantmen. Tyre and Zidon, you know, they were the commerce people. They moved things, they shipped things. That's what their business was. And in this time, it's pretty much the same, only now they're involved more in politics. In other words, they are the power behind the power that we see.
It's the powers that should not be. That makes sense. And with this Federal Reserve System, I think it's interesting to point out that every dollar that is issued to the United States is owed back plus interest to the Federal Reserve System. Now, saying that may not drive the point home for a lot of people, but there's this exercise that I do with people that don't really understand this, and it's a very simple exercise. All you really need is 2 Federal Reserve notes. You need 2 $1 bills. And what I do is I'll tell them, I said, okay, we're going to play a role-playing game here. I'm the Federal Reserve. You, from now on, you refer to me as Mr. Federal Reserve. And yourself, you will be Mr. Taxpayer, or perhaps even Mr. Bank. And I'm going to loan you this dollar bill, and I'm going to loan it to you at 10% interest. And so here you go. Now you can take that dollar and you can invest it anywhere you want. You can spend it anywhere you want. You can loan it out, whatever it is you want to do. But you owe me back a dollar plus 10% interest. And they usually say, well, okay, no problem. That's no big deal. So they'll go on and they'll do that. And I'll say, okay, well, looks like you're getting low. So here's another dollar bill. So they'll take that one. And I'll say, okay, now you invest that. Now give me my money back. So most people will hand me both the $2 bills back and say, well, here you go. Say, no, you still owe me 20 cents. Well, I don't have 20 cents. You didn't give me 20 cents. And exactly. And, I'm the only one that's allowed to print American dollars. So, I hate to tell you, but you owe me this 20 cents. Well, I can't pay you. Well, that's the whole point, ladies and gentlemen. That is the whole point. When you look up and you see our nation's debt skyrocketing, it's because of many different things, but the vast majority of it is this money lending criminal operation that's going on under our noses, that's masquerading as a federally owned bank. But it's not. It's only as Federal Reserve is. It's privately owned, and they have a monopoly on our money. As a matter of fact, there was this man named Mayor Amschel Bauer Rothschild, who made a famous quote. He said, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." They have complete and utter control. And as a country, we're really at their mercy. So, any comments on that, gentlemen?
The best place for a beginner to go get a working knowledge of the Federal Reserve System is an article that you can look up called Federal Reserve Bank Incorporated, A Murderous History. Banksters, the World's Worst Gangsters is the name of it. And here I'll read a little bit from it, which picks up right after the formation of it in 1913. And it says, World War I started on June 28, 1914, as a direct consequence of the formation of the Federal Reserve Bank. It would not have been possible to start World War I without the formation of the Federal Reserve Bank. The primary beneficiaries of World War I were the owners of the Federal Reserve Bank. And then it says, after World War I had turned the United States from a debtor nation into a creditor nation, in the aftermath of the war, both the victorious Allies and the defeated Central Powers owed the United States more money than it owed to foreign nations. The Republican administrations of the 1920s insisted on payments in gold bullion, but the world's gold supply was limited, and by the end of the 1920s, the United States itself controlled much of the world's gold supply. Then, April 5th, 1933 is when President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a treasonous executive order ordering citizens to hand their gold and gold certificates to the private Federal Reserve Bank. And here's the executive order. Executive Order number 6102, Section 2. All persons are hereby required to deliver on or before May 1st, 1933. That's the birthday of the Illuminati, by the way, from 1776. To a Federal Reserve Bank or a branch or agency thereof, or to any member bank of the Federal Reserve System, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates now owned by them or coming into their ownership on or before April 28, 1933. Section 9. Whoever willfully violates any provision of this executive order or of these regulations or of any rule, regulation, or license issued thereunder may be fined not more than $10,000, or if a natural person, may be imprisoned for not more than 10 years, or both. And then the article goes on to read, FDR proceeded to implement the New Deal, which converted the United States of America to the United Socialist States of America, instituting pure socialism and Social Security, the FCC to control the airwaves, the SEC to control banking and eliminate any potential competitors to the private Federal Reserve Bank. And as I said before, 1944 and 1945, you had the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and then the World Bank. That's when it went global. So there you have it.
You know what's the interesting thing, too, is that John F. Kennedy tried to put America back on the silver standard, and he authorized the printing of silver certificates so that you could, in other words, own silver in the form of a note. And I believe it was 5 months later, wasn't it, Sam, that he was dead?
Yeah, that's in that article too. That's Executive Order 11110, which, and then the article says this order virtually stripped the Federal Reserve Bank of its power to loan money to the United States government at interest, like Ryan was saying, could no longer loan it at interest. President Kennedy declared the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank would soon be out of business. This order gave the Treasury Department the authority to issue silver certificates against any silver in the Treasury. This executive order still stands today. In less than 5 months after signing that executive order, President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. The United States notes, because if you go look them up, it don't say Federal Reserve at the top. Go look it up and you can see for yourself. The United States notes silver certificates, that's what it says at the top, he had issued were taken out of circulation immediately. So if there wasn't nothing to it, why'd they take it out of circulation immediately, you know? Federal Reserve notes continued to serve as the legal currency of this nation. It is estimated that 99% of all U.S. paper currency circulating in 1999 are Federal Reserve notes.
You know, that's very interesting. But it's really nothing new with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's nothing new at all. It's in fact, it's their modus operandi, and I'll give you an example of that. Now, you were taught in school that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by a man named John Wilkes Booth at the Ford Theater, but you were also taught that John Wilkes Booth was a Confederate sympathizer, and he was angry at Lincoln over the Civil War and the fact that the Northern Army had defeated the Confederates. But that's not exactly true. What you really need to pay attention to is what happened leading up to Lincoln's assassination. It does not differ a great deal from John F. Kennedy's Civil War side. In fact, Abraham Lincoln did the exact same thing John F. Kennedy did. He went to the bankers initially, and they were going to loan him money to wage the Civil War. And I believe it was somewhere around 20% interest. And Abraham Lincoln balked at that, and he decided that he would have the Department of Treasury begin printing notes, printing greenbacks that were backed up by either gold or silver. And that angered the bankers greatly. And so they had him assassinated as well. It really is no different from John F. Kennedy's assassination. The only difference there is far fewer people tend to realize that's why Abraham Lincoln was killed than there are people that realize that's why John F. Kennedy was killed.
Well, again, that's history for you. I mean, there's real history, and there's the history you're taught from school books and in school, which is part of the educational system. So again, you can see how these are intertwined, how they work together, and you'll see it even better as we get into the political arena, which actually we're already into a little bit, and the religious arena of this four hidden dynasties.
Let's keep going after Kennedy a little bit with the while we're at it, with this book by Dr. Gary North called Government by Emergency. Real quickly, during the final months of President Johnson's administration, the Federal Reserve System, our nation's central bank, stopped the increase of new money coming into the economy. President Nixon continued to support the Federal Reserve's decision for the first year in office. The results were, or should have been, predictable: increased unemployment, a disastrous fall in the stock market, falling industrial profits, and decreased tax revenues. Ironically, the end of monetary inflation did not bring an end to price inflation. People apparently could not bring themselves to believe that tight money, high rates of interest, and zero monetary inflation would persist. They did not believe that President Nixon would pursue indefinitely a policy of balanced budgets, reduced government expenditures, and higher taxes, which is the way you stop prices from rising. So labor and business kept passing on higher and higher prices to the consumer, and the man out of work, the marginal business, and the self-employed laborer found the economic squeeze disastrous. The general public kept bidding for goods. And perhaps this explains what happened to Nixon. It sounds like he wasn't good for business. Balanced budgets, reduced government expenditures, and higher taxes, but that's the way you stop prices from rising. So there's that too. And it just continues up to now.
Yeah, and all we're seeing is an increase in inflation, a continued devaluation of the dollar that is really epidemic. And it's not just limited to the United States. It goes on all around the world. And you have other countries around the world that are looking to new systems. Take, for instance, BRICS. Now, that is made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and what's the other one? Singapore?
South Africa.
Oh, okay, South Africa. So they're looking to blaze a trail and do something different, but I think it's more of just a competitor to this whole system. They're looking to do the same thing. I really don't think that it's really going to be that great. And when you look at this in the grand scheme of things, all it's about is making those that are not super rich poor, and those that are super rich even richer. I mean, it kind of goes without saying. I mean, take a look at what's been in the headlines recently, guys, with the minimum wage, and they're having protesters, McDonald's workers protesting for a $15 minimum wage. And I think it was last episode, Bruce, that you had mentioned, hey, these people don't realize what they're doing because minimum wage goes up. Yeah, they might do okay for a month or so until the cost of things catches up, because employers have to protect their profit and loss. So their costs are going to go up, and really there will be no wage increase.
Exactly. And I'll tell you how you can gauge that. In the last show, I pointed out that in 1973, the average wage was about $2.73 an hour, and it went up subsequently to $3, $3.35, $4, $4.50, and it's continued to go up. But so have prices gone up. In other words, I can remember a few years ago when gas was, well, I say a few years. It's been a while back, but I remember buying gas for 77 cents a gallon. In other words, I could take $12 and fill my car up. You could buy a sirloin steak for 99 cents a pound. You could buy a hamburger for 39 cents. Contrast that to today. If you go to any market, USA, and buy a steak, you're going to pay between $7 and $9 a pound, depending on what area of the country you are. Obviously, up north, things are a little more expensive, but you're going to pay between $7 and $9 per pound for a piece of meat. For a hamburger now, you can go to any hamburger place. I remember when the Big Mac was about 69 cents. A Big Mac sandwich now will cost you roughly, I believe it's about $3.69.
And that's just the sandwich. That's no drink or fries.
Yeah. And it's the same with the Whopper and Wendy's big sandwich and everybody else's. You could go to Kentucky Fried Chicken and get an entire meal for $7.99. Now it'll cost you about $23.99. That is inflation. And guess what is going to happen if they take these employees that are already making $550, $650, $750, depending on what state they're in, some of them even more, shift leaders and such. Imagine what's going to happen if they boost them all up to where the minimum wage is 14 or 15 bucks an hour. Well, that means that not only are the regular daily employees, the 40-hour-a-week guys and girls, excuse me, no sex intended there, are going to be making 14 or 15 bucks an hour. The shift leaders are going to be making more. The managers are going to be making more than that. Well, guess what that's going to do to the company? That's going to cost them. And they are going to pass that cost on because they have to keep a profit margin in order to keep their doors open and to make a profit. One goes into business to make a profit. Profit is not a sin. Filthy lucre is a sin. But making a profit is not a sin. So what's going to happen is you're going to be looking at 40 or 50 bucks for a meal to feed your family, one meal. I mean, as it stands right now, you can take your family out to an Outback restaurant or something like that, and for about 50 or 60 bucks, you can feed 3 or 4 people. But what's going to happen when the minimum wage goes up? Well, it's going to be 120 bucks. Everything's going to double. May not double right away. It may go up slowly. You've got companies right now that are already increasing their profit margin by 30 cents. In other words, cat and dog food just went up 30 cents. Cough medicines, things like that, stuff that you buy daily have jumped up 30 cents. And that's just the first little step. In a few more months, they'll jump it up another 30 or 40 cents, depending, because they're preparing for this minimum wage increase. And if they get it, they're going to really skyrocket the price. Now, if they do not get the minimum wage increase, then prices will probably gradually come back down a little bit to a more manageable status. But I doubt seriously that happened, because you've got so many people out there, lobbyists and politicians and everyone pushing for this minimum wage increase, thinking it's going to be the Superman that comes out of the phone booth to save them, when really it's kryptonite. It's going to poison them. It's going to ruin them. It's going to ruin the economy of the United States, which is what they're out to do. In other words, crippling the United States is what the whole game is about. That's what the whole economic thing is about. That's why we're not allowed to drill for our own oil. I mean, yeah, we do have oil wells, but we have vast, rich oil reserves, which we're not allowed to touch because we might endanger the spotted owl or the perky striped frog. You know, it's all that leads into the environment aspect of the Four Hidden Dynasties, which is of itself not a separate thing. It's part of all of it. In other words, it's part of the politics. It's part of the education, because kids are being brainwashed with global warming and climate change and all of that. And endangered species. You know, species have been going extinct on this planet since there was life on this planet. And it's nothing new. But they act like it's a whole new thing. And the same thing with global warming. The Earth goes through cycles of heating and cooling. You know, they predicted, Al Gore, I remember about 7 or 8 or maybe more years ago, said that in 5 years' time, Miami would be underwater. New York, Brooklyn would be underwater. Well, guess what? It's not underwater. And if I go down to the same beach that I've gone to since I was a kid, the water is still coming up and lapping at the same place that it was then, save of erosion of a hurricane or something like that. It's a lot of BS that people believe. You know, it's good to be earth conscious, but look at how people just throw their trash out on the side of the road. You know, that's something that you don't see a lot in Europe. Germany is one of the cleanest nations that you'll ever see, because people have respect for the land there. But here they do not have the same respect. Like I was standing out with a friend one day at his mailbox, and somebody rode by and threw a bottle out of their car, and it busted right at our feet. And of course, we yelled at the person, and they just kept going. But there's no pride in the country here. So again, you see how all this works together.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And with regards to the minimum wage push for the increase, I want to direct the listeners over to McDonald's.com. They actually have a newsroom on their website, and it says here, I'm just going to read the first couple of sentences. It says, this was updated on September 5th of this year. It says, during the most recent day of demonstrations, McDonald's restaurants were open for business as usual and welcomed customers. We reiterate that these were not strikes, but were staged demonstrations in which people were transported to fast food restaurants, and we have received reports that some participants were paid up to $500 to protest and get arrested. You see, this isn't something that a whole lot of people are really truly pushing for. I mean, if you have to pay somebody $500 just to protest something, obviously you don't have too many people that feel this way. They're just doing it for money. But on that same note, minimum wage, that's something that people have well, it's been around for a long time, but nobody really knows, unless they happen to think to look it up, when minimum wage began. Well, it was instituted in 1938. And guess how much it was? It was 25 cents per hour in 1938. Now, that was obviously a livable wage. That was something that paid someone enough to live. However, if you adjust that 25 cents for inflation, today that 25 cents would be worth $4.13. That's when you adjust it to inflation. Now, if you look at that, I don't think anybody can live on $4.13 per hour in today's money. It's just impossible. You couldn't do it hardly, unless your house was paid for and it was insulated very well and you just had a tiny amount of bills. But you might even have a hard time feeding yourself, much less.
Unless you got a house full of about 15 people.
Yeah, exactly. So just so everybody that's listening knows, I actually got these figures off of CNN Money. So I didn't pull this off of any Wikipedia article. This comes directly from CNN Money. And what I want to stress here is that, like I said, $4.13 an hour would not pay for you to live today. But 25 cents, when you adjust it back for inflation back to 38, did. Now, what's important is that with every increase in the minimum wage, that brings about an increase in products and services. Therefore, we have to spend more money. Therefore, the Federal Reserve has to print more money, and they give it to the United States at interest, thereby increasing our national debt. So you can see how much we've increased. The average minimum wage across the country, I think it's somewhere around $9 now. And when you look at $4.13, that's really what it could be when you just factor in inflation, but you can't live on that. That just kind of goes to show you at the level at which this criminal organization has taken our country and is taking our money. And we've got to the point now where we can't even make payments on the interest, much less the principal. So it is completely gone. I seriously doubt it, even if we were to shut the Federal Reserve System down tonight, there probably would still be no coming back from it. And I'm not saying this to, frighten anyone or depress anyone. There's really no reason you should be depressed, because we know that we are living in the last generation of this earth age. We're living in the generation of the fig tree, and such things must needs be. But I think it's important for us to arm ourselves with the truth. And this right here just tells you how far along we've gone.
Well, it does. And, you know, another thing that you hear all the time now is global community or global family. You know, they don't say new world order anymore. You know, they used to say that, but now they say world community, unilateral cooperation, words like that, words that are more palatable, more easy to swallow. But that is why, in other words, this agenda to keep us dependent on foreign oil, when we've got oil here within the nation, within the continental U.S., within Alaska, we've got fracking that could be done to get natural gas. We've got natural gas reserves. We sold the very oil wells that exploded, in other words, the ones that BP owned, were sold to Brazil along with a bunch of American ones. And guess what? The Brazilians are pumping the same wells. And do you know why we shut them down? Because they were too dangerous to run. Well, if they're too dangerous to run, how come the Brazilians are running them? Well, that's the Brazilians and not us. You know, what kind of sense does that make? That means now we have to buy oil from Brazil too.
Who are part of the BRICS Bank.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you can see how this is all shaping up and why we're kept dependent. I mean, look at everything in America. If you go into any Walmart, any store USA, pick up something and look at it and see if it doesn't say made in Taiwan or Heco in Mexico or made in China. Very few things are made in America anymore because it's too expensive to make things in America. Why? Because of taxation, because of fines and levies, because of all sorts of agendas that stop us as Americans from making a profit. And people will cause this, in other words, the politicians, well, I shouldn't even say the politicians, they're just puppets on the strings. But the ones that do cause this tell the politicians, okay, this company's fixing to move out of America so they can keep their profit margin. So you launch a campaign against them. You launch a campaign, you get protesters out in front of their buildings chanting all sorts of things about how they're deserting America and leaving Americans jobless to go overseas because they're rich and they're money grubbers and they want to keep their money. And in some cases, as far as the high paid executives, yeah, that may be the case. But you cannot keep a business open in this country if you cannot make profit. And they're making it where you cannot make profit. So they are going overseas to China, to Japan, to Taiwan, to Mexico, or to anywhere else they can where they don't have to pay the same kind of a minimum wage. They don't have to pay health care benefits. They don't have to pay a whole lot of this BS that Americans are forced to pay to run businesses.
Oh, yeah.
That's why our profit margin is lower than any other in the world when it used to be higher.
Oh, yeah. Look at one perfect example of that is Halliburton, Dick Cheney's company. I don't think he actually owns it anymore, but he's a consultant there. Halliburton, an actually pretty evil company that's been building FEMA camps and all sorts of things besides fracking and drilling for oil. That's only one small part of their business. But their headquarters is in the Middle East, and their CEO that runs the company is based right there in the Middle East. And don't think it's just because of the oil industry. It has a lot to do with taxation as well.
Well, we know, like you said, that this has to come to pass. There's no way of getting around it. But when they have to bust people in, it's just like what went on with the Trayvon Martin thing. It's just like what went on here recently in Ferguson. They brought people in from the outside. They bust them in. Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton. Of course, they show up at everything to protest. And when they turn out to be wrong, they're unapologetic about it and they don't mention it again, because that has happened with the 3 boys in the Carolina University that had the black woman try to charge them with rape. And it turns out that she had quite a checkered past of telling lies and being in trouble. And, you know, see, that's the thing about it. If you say anything like that, I'm probably going to be labeled as a racist for even mentioning that, but I care not, because I stand on a foundation of truth. But they bust these people in. It's just like that Wall Street movement, the Wall Street sit-in or the Occupy movement. You think that was real? That wasn't real. That wasn't real grassroots Americans. That was a bunch of paid political cronies driven by lobbyists, which are pushed by the powers that be, in other words, the Kenites, and politicians on the left joining in with them arm in arm, showing their support for them, people like Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, and the usual suspects. Yet you can't get Christians to do anything. You can't get Christians to stand up for themselves. You can't get Christians, well, you know what? You don't even have to say Christians. You can say Americans. It can be atheists. It can be agnostics. People will not stand up for this country the same way that the progressive, liberal, organized machine does. They just won't do it. And that is a sad testimony. And again, Deuteronomy chapter 28. Read it and understand that it is a type and example. It's not just for Israel, it's also very much for these end times, this generation of the fig tree.
Absolutely. The head shall be the tail, and the tail shall become the head.
Yeah.
What do you think about all this, Sam? Anything to add there?
Well, if anybody out there doesn't think this is all meant to be, it's the negative part of God's plan coming to pass, then I would say turn to Revelation chapter 6 and verse 5, and there you have the third seal, the third horseman, the black one, and that would be famine. But does it line up with the hidden dynasty of economics? Well, let's just read it and see if it does. And it says, "And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast, the third living creature, say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand." And Amos chapter 8 will tell you about these balances of deceit. And verse 6, "And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 beasts, the 4 living creatures, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." So there you go right there. Remember last time we covered the 4th seal, and then if these go backwards, they're not in chronological order, and then you would go count down to the 2nd seal, which would line up with politics. Point being, there you have it in that 6th verse, a measure of wheat for a penny and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And a penny back then was a day's wage. That's not a lot for a day's wage. That's like a loaf of bread for a day's wage. So you see there's inflation there, control of the economy, and there's also a spiritual aspect of it. Again, Amos chapter 8, the famine for hearing the word of the Lord. And if they would hear that, we wouldn't have these situations going on with people totally in the dark and not knowing, much of anything, because they don't study God's Word. There's a famine for it being taught. And go to a church and see what they're talking about. It ain't God's Word. I have yet to walk into a church and hear, okay, today we're going to get out your Strong's Concordance and we're going to go into this chapter and really study it and see what God really has to say. You don't see that, do you?
No, very, very rare. We are definitely in the famine for hearing God's word. That's for certain.
That ties
but
into
with that
economics
said-
too.
With that said, you also can't say, well, because these things have to come to pass, there's nothing we can do about it. There most certainly are things we can do about it. I mean, we've got the rights in this country still, believe it or not, despite all that's happened, to vote. And if people would vote conservatives into office, then we could limit some of this. In other words, we know we've got to go into global government. We know that there will be a one world system. We know that the Antichrist is coming. Those of us who have studied the Bible enough know that there's not going to be a rapture. In other words, a pre-tribulation rapture. And by the way, they've just released that movie with Nicolas Cage, Left Behind, and it's all the rage now. Everyone's writing, "Are you ready? Are you ready?"
Left Behind. I thought that was Left with My Head Up My Behind. I could be wrong.
Basically, that's right. But all of this is for lack of knowledge. In other words, for lack of knowledge, the people suffer. And these people get control over us in this way. Like I said, we know we have to go into global government. We know that certain things have to go to pass, but we do not have to go there as progressives. We don't have to tolerate these things. We can turn certain things around and make the time that we have left better. But they're not going to allow, I guarantee you, one of the things behind all these illegals pouring into our country, first of all, there's all these diseases. Well, what's that going to cause? Well, that's going to cause a bunch of sickness all over the country. People are going to be running to the hospital anytime they sneeze.
Pestilences.
You got all these people, you got all these people pouring into the country, which guess who they're going to vote for when they get in here? Are they going to vote for those hateful, spiteful Republican conservatives that didn't want them in here because they're a bunch of bigoted racists? No, they're going to vote for the sweet-talking, honey-dripping Democrats who say, yes, come right in. Come right in. You're so welcome. We want you here, even though it's illegal. And we all took oaths to defend the Constitution and defend the borders of the United States of America and to uphold the laws. We're just not going to do them. We're going to ignore them. We're going to write executive orders. And, if Congress stands up against us or the Senate stands up against us, the president's going to take out his little pen and veto it. It all works together to one end, to bring about one world government. And not only that, each of these people that come into this country are coming in here poor with nothing but the shirts on their backs. Guess what they're going to sign up for as soon as they get across the border? Welfare, WIC, SNAP. And of course, they're coming in pregnant or with many children, because many of them are of the Catholic belief and do not believe in any sort of birth control. And so they pour into the country, and guess who's got to support them? The American taxpayer. Well, do you know that last year a poll was taken and there are more people not working than there are working? Do you know what happens in a country where there are more people not working than working?
You go broke.
Yeah, and the ones not working are getting benefits. I can tell you what happens. Destruction from within. So there you go. That's your economy. That's the thing that is supposed to sustain us being destroyed. And again, the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28.
Absolutely. And this is no different than those false weights and measures that they were using in the temple when Christ overturned the money changers' tables.
Yes.
This is false weights and balances in this economy. This is things that are derived by men in order to get rich and make destitute the rest of the population.
Well, that is what the Kenites do. In every war, let's say, I really should say every war, but really you probably can't say that. But
most of them. I know where you're going. Probably most of them.
At least every war since, let's say since the British monarchy was overthrown, and that's probably not an accurate deduction, but let's just say that the Kenites have funded both sides of everything. In other words, they funded World War I, both sides, Germany, France, Britain. They funded World War II. They funded the Civil War in the United States, 1861 to 1865. They funded the Spanish-American War. In other words, they always play both sides of the field. In that way, they never lose. Whichever side comes out on top, they win. And you know that they have done this because it is documented within the history books that they are the ones that put a lot of money into these things. It's just like Rothschild, Meyer Rothschild, I believe it was, or maybe it was Amschel. I'm not really sure at this moment which Rothschild it was, but during the French Revolution, he had spies on the front lines with carrier pigeons. And as soon as he knew that Wellington had won the battle over Napoleon, he went into the British version of the New York Stock Exchange, in other words, the exchange that was in Britain, and he went in there in a panic, and he was a well-respected man, and everybody watched exactly what he did. In other words, they knew that he was a moneymaker. So they watched him. All the fat cats watched him, and they saw him getting rid of all of his British stock. Everything that he had British, they saw him selling it off in a panic. And he was even taking a loss on it. So they followed suit. They did the exact same thing. They sold all their British stock, assuming that Napoleon had won the war. And he even had some of his spies running around saying Napoleon has won the battle of Waterloo. And he was a day ahead of everyone else in knowing this because, like I said, he had spies on the front lines that sent carrier pigeons straight to him, straight to his operatives, and he got the news a full day ahead of anyone else. So he caused this panic in the stock market. Everyone sold off all their stuff, and whenever they got through selling it off, he went around and bought it up for pennies on the dollar and made a mint. He made himself quasi-millions of dollars just in that one act. And he did it on purpose. He did it for the gain. And that is the trademark of what Kenites do. And they pull the same things right here, right now, and all down through history. Like I said, they have made kingdoms, they have broken kingdoms, they have made nations, they have broken nations. They're probably what's behind Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In other words, they are the shadow government makers and breakers. And they're probably what's going on with all of this.
Exactly. You know, that man you were talking about, his name was Nathan Mayer Rothschild.
Yeah, Nathan Mayer, that's right.
But
okay.
What was interesting is he had a quote that's very similar to his father Mayer's. And he actually said something very similar. He said, I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire in which the sun never sets. The man who controls the British money supply controls the British empire, and I control the British money supply. And he was known as the man who bought England or stole England. But what's so interesting about these spies you talk about is the fact that the Rothschild family, obviously, they financed both sides. They financed both England and France. And it was them and only them that were given the ability to cross the lines from the French to the English, from the English to the French. And they had their own areas that they were able to stay in, and no troop from either side would dare stop a Rothschild messenger.
Well, I'm not surprised by that. They were also behind the Russian Revolution. You know, they funded the Tsar, and they funded the uprising that killed off the Tsar. It was written ahead of time that the king of Edom's bones would be burned into lime. And of course, a lot of people read that in the Bible and they think it's the king of Edom of the biblical times. And of course, it probably was in the historical sense. But if we look at it in a prophetical sense, then where does that take us to? All that was written so long ago, and yet it took place in 1918.
Amos chapter 2, verse 1 on that. I was in the Minor Prophets anyway because of Amos chapter 8 from earlier.
Yeah, well, my point is, it was prophesied to happen. Just like it's prophesied that, Russia is going to come against the United States. A lot of people wouldn't recognize that because they don't know who the house of Israel is. They don't know what Manasseh stands for. They don't know what Ephraim stands for. In other words, they know the historical Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph. They may even know the meaning of the names, forgetful and fruitful. But they have no idea how it relates to us in these end times and how it relates to Europe and the United States. Europe, of course, being fruitful because it was out of Europe that all these nations were made: Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, all the colonies, and the United States, the forgetful nation, which is ever and ever more turning its back on God. And again, Deuteronomy 28, the curse is being fulfilled, just as God promised us they would be.
As far as financing both sides, if you go back to World War I, it was John D. Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan, basically, or what was left of his estate after he died in 1913. But my point is, what do you need to run a war? You need oil, right? Well, Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller was running that. Carnegie had U.S. Steel. You need steel to make weapons. So they ran a war monopoly at that time, having bought and paid for the president, Woodrow Wilson, which is how they pulled off the Federal Reserve implementation. Because
that brings up a very interesting point. You know that the bullets and the airplanes that came against us and the aircraft carriers of Japan that came against us on December 7th, 1941, and all through World War II were American steel sold to the Japanese.
That would be Andrew Carnegie.
Yeah.
Thanks. What was the other one? There was a third one, but I think it was J.P. Morgan, and then it was that they had a lot of information that's kind of watered down on that History Channel, Men Who Built America.
Yeah.
And they mentioned Rothschild one time, and they kind of hint at the fact that Morgan was a Rothschild agent. But he died completely broke. I mean, how does a guy that rich die broke? Well, Mullins was probably right. He was probably a Rothschild agent, because you couldn't have England over here doing all that.
And, I think an important thing to note is that with the first central bank of the United States, then later the second central bank of the United States, then even later the Federal Reserve System, which we are under servitude to this day, all of them have been owned primarily by London bankers. Now you've got some American bankers in there, but you look at them and you research them and you quickly get back to the Rothschilds of England. And you can begin to see a picture in which the Revolutionary War of the United States was only a partial win, in that we were able to effectively separate politically from Great Britain, but economically, not so. And when I say Great Britain, I'm really talking about the Rothschilds.
Yeah. Well, you
Red
know,
Shield.
yeah. Well, that's what Rothschild means, Red Shield. But it's the same thing with Russia. And I'm not speaking of the Russian people per se, but Lenin and Trotsky met in New York City, in a hotel in New York City, and planned the communist revolution. And that's a matter of historical fact. You know, that's not something you get off Wikipedia. That's a matter of historical fact that they planned the Russian Revolution in America just a few years before they implemented it. And it was based off the ideals of Marxism.
And why red? Red Shield. I mean, they rub it in your face, don't they?
Yeah.
It's like the Joker leaving his Joker card on the bodies or something like that. Calling card. It was me, ha ha ha.
Yeah.
Yeah, they want so badly to kind of get caught. They want people to know what they do.
Well,
but not
now
enough
it's so
to give
blatant
you a
until they
chance.
can. I mean, they own everything. They run everything. You know, they can afford to shove it in your face.
Yeah, Henry Kissinger's new book is actually called World Order. He's not even trying to disguise himself anymore.
Henry Kissinger writing a book. It must have taken him years.
That's a pretty good impression. Well, all right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you've enjoyed our second episode of Quickening Stream. Next week, be sure and tune in. We will be talking about the hidden dynasty of politics. I think you'll enjoy this next one. And once again, Bruce, thank you for being on.
My pleasure.
And Sam, also, thank you for being on. We really enjoy having everyone together to engage in some good dialogue on these things. I think it's important that we all think about it.
And I've got Eustace Mullins' Secrets of the Federal Reserve linked up on mark13records.com if you want to research this further. It's in the Globalist Agenda section, mark13records.com.
Yeah, go to mark13records.com. In addition to that, Sam also has a lot of really good news links and links to Bible studies and all those things on there. But Eustace Mullins, Secrets of the Federal Reserve, is a book that I own the hard copy of and have read. It's a great book. It's a great resource, and it will definitely help you understand why we're in the situation today that we're in.
And for Logan of Firebrand Ministries, let me say good night, everybody, because Logan had to take off, and he was gracious enough to come on for a little bit with us, but he had to run.
Logan, if you can hear me, thanks, buddy. See you next week, and God bless you.
Book of Habakkuk, to embrace in the Hebrew, another installment in the audio Bible study series on Mark 13 Records. Does this book concern this final generation? You bet. As it's written in the second chapter in the third verse, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. This audio CD is great for sharing with those who may have not heard the truth of God's Word, and or those without internet access, or what have you. For information on how to order, write us at mark13records@mail.com and ask how to purchase the Book of Habakkuk. Fantastic. You'll enjoy it.